there were close to 50 registered early this afternoon, so I'd like to give it a few more minutes. I know there was a miscommunication earlier about the time, which the festival assured me got corrected. So I assume everybody who wants to be here knows the correct time, but let's give it a few more minutes and then we'll start. And I appreciate all of you being here on time.
Mark on? Oh, he's muted.
We're giving another 2 minutes or so, because I see people jumping on. Okay, well, it's 7:33. I don't see anybody in the waiting room at the moment, so we're about to start. I'm Mark Schoenfield, and I know that that there was a mistake on the time. At one point, the festival assured me it had been corrected, and so I'm hoping it was corrected because I have no way of controlling that. But if people jump on late, so be it, and we'll just take it from there. Welcome to this session of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Festival, a moral and political virtual gathering. This program is brought to you by the Israel Committee and the Environmental Climate Action Committee of Beth Emet Synagogue in Evanston, Illinois. I'm Mark Schoenfield, and my co-presenter tonight will be Harry Rhodes, who you may see on your screen, depending on how this is all situated. Because we're going to be on more than one screen, I have a feeling, and for other reasons as well, please use the chat if you have comments or questions, and then at the end we'll try to go to the chat and pick anything up that we can. Okay. Give me 1 second here as to why this is not full screen. Okay. All right. Israel, climate change challenges, adaptation, mitigation for itself and the world. So let's start with desertification. You know, Israel originally was mainly desert. And with climate change, the desert has expanded and is expanding here and elsewhere from hot and dry conditions, or at least trying to. 95% of Israel is arid, which means it can't support vegetation normally if it was allowed to just do what the ground would do by itself. The Negev Desert is 60% of Israel, and there are ever-present threats of soil degradation and desertification, meaning the desert begins to grow as the soil breaks down and becomes sand. And so you have deserts that spread here and elsewhere in the world if they're allowed to do that. Now, one of the ways that Israel has fought against climate change, and this actually started long ago, not biblical times, but in modern times long ago, is Israeli drip technology. Israel invented plastic emitters with these lines, which have long spiral microtube water passages with two-piece drippers to save water. And what happens here is that the water is released through the long passageway slowed by friction. Instead of using, as originally was thought, tiny openings, the tiny openings kept getting stuck with little pieces of soil and other particle matter that would clog up the lines. So they used friction, figured out a way to use friction in longer passageways and have the water drip right into the root areas so that the water actually goes right to where it's needed. You get more crop per drop and you avoid evaporation losses. When you spray water in a field up in the air and have it land on things, on plants, on water, on whatever's there, the sunlight and the heat cause an evaporation loss, which is significant. This way, small amounts of water per plant are really very effective. And it may be as little as several drops per hour per drip point. With this technology, Israel achieves 80% agricultural water efficiency, saving 25 to 75% of water compared to flood irrigation. That is, if you just spray the water up or try to have it overground, just flooding the area. And we see here up in the upper left fields, the emitter in the upper right and the lines themselves being placed in the lower right. Another aspect of what goes on, and this of course has gone on for a long time in Israel, is the Jewish National Fund tree planting. Planting trees in Israel for over a century, over 250 million trees, which changed the land from desert, and today is helping to keep the land from becoming desert again. You have to choose a variety of trees that are indigenous to the area being planted so that they actually fit. And what happens is that the plant life through the roots and the nutrients helps create a cycle of nutritious health that nourishes the soil. That's why it stops desertification. Some of the trees grow well in the desert, surviving on winter runoff alone, but they're also helping to keep that soil from becoming pure desert. Indigenous trees in Israel include olive, palm, oak, Jerusalem pine, sycamore, and cypress. The water systems that are used include runoff and rainfall catchment basins, that is depressions that are formed either naturally or through human endeavor, treated wastewater, which is not fit for drinking but can be used for the trees, and for some trees, brackish water for salt-tolerant trees. Another aspect of combating desertification is to use solar power instead of cutting down trees for firewood. We'll talk more about solar power as we go through the presentation. In 1995 in the United States, property damage insurers started writing property damage insurance differently in a number of areas that had large forests because of increased dry lightning strikes, that is lightning without rain, and drier vegetation. So the problem of increased forest fires from climate change goes back a ways. And in Israel and other places, this has become a major problem, as you may have read at times in the news. So Israel has done a number of things. It has switched from pine plantings to less flammable trees, such as cedars, oaks, artabus, carob, and fig. It has developed high precision aerial drops, that is using airplanes to drop water or biodegradable foam pellets, and creating more fire breaks, that is spaces in the forest between the trees wide enough that the fire is not likely to jump it easily. And they're using grazing goats, cows, and sheep in order to hold those fire breaks in place. In addition, in order to create remote warnings of the danger, humidity sensing phones are left in places in the forest. And when the sensors find that there's not enough humidity and there's a danger created, the phone calls the officials and says, there's a danger here. And then they can try to prepare better for lightning strike fires. Now, one of the new inventions by an Israeli company is a firefighting laser to remove treetop vegetation. Fires in forests don't just spread tree to tree or bush to bush overall, but they often go treetop to treetop, having the leaves or the vegetation growing on the tree, if it's a pine, catch fire first, heat everything up, and then the tree catches fire. So the concept here is to use algorithm-controlled laser beams, computer controlled via helicopter or truck. The lasers work very fast, so that when they're burning the leaves, they basically disintegrate the leaves almost instantly and then switch off that part, so that combustion on that tree is immediately extinguished. So you get a bare tree, as you see here next to the fires, and that is the idea there is to create a fire break during the fire where the fire can't jump treetop to treetop. And let's see an animation of how that works, hopefully. All right, so here we have our fire coming. There's our helicopter with our laser. It's burning the leaves off there. The next tree will catch fire, but then the fire will be stopped because there's a fire break in effect. So this is still in the prototype stage. Hang on one second here, because I don't know why this is going on. Okay. All right. This is still in the prototype stage of a particular company in Israel, but it's an interesting innovation in which there's a lot of interest in the United States and elsewhere. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that is CO2 and methane, most of the energy in Israel is produced from natural gas and coal. Israel is working hard to decrease its coal usage. It's developing large offshore natural gas fields. And as you may know, natural gas produces a lot less CO2 than coal. So it's an improvement, but it's not enough. Israel does not use nuclear power, has very little oil. So the picture you see here is of a solar energy plant. All those little rectangles there are materials that collect solar energy and transmit the electricity to the power plant you see in the background. Photovoltaic means that they absorb the sunlight, it knocks the electrons loose from the atoms, flowing through the panel and producing electricity, which is then transmitted to the power plant for further transmission. Right now, renewables are less than 5% of Israel's electricity. So Israel is committed to increasing solar energy and actually could provide 90% plus of its future electrical needs from solar energy once it builds enough solar energy plants. One of the interesting things the Israelis have done is there was an invention of solar water heaters. They use a special coating so that the heater heats up sufficiently without the use of electricity when there's sun. And that already saves about 8% of the country's energy needs. It is mandatory on all residential buildings up to 9 stories in Israel. In terms of greenhouse gases, the large forests do remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the trees and the soil and produce oxygen into the atmosphere. However, trees and CO2 have a life cycle analysis we should be aware of. That is, when a tree dies, the CO2 gradually gets released. When a tree is cut down, depending on what's done with it, CO2 can be released from the tree and also from the process of cutting. So forests alone aren't always a total answer in terms of CO2 and oxygen. You really have to look at the details, as the Israelis are doing. Israel has started using biodegradable food packaging instead of plastic. The Israelis have a home biogas machine using waste to produce renewable gas in small amounts. And there's an outdoor fabric that's been developed for solar power cells that can be put outdoors over walkways and other areas. And so while it's providing shade, it also produces solar power. To me, the most interesting development, though, and I saved it for the last part of this slide, are electric vehicle roads. In Tel Aviv, the first electric vehicle roads are being developed for buses, and you see the picture in the lower right. Copper coils are being placed under the streets, and there will be receivers placed in the vehicles so that the roads transmit energy to the battery of the vehicle. So if you haven't charged your vehicle, you drive on the road and it gets a charge as you're driving. Quite a development for electric powered vehicles. Green buildings are another part of Israel's actions against climate change. Improving building energy is done much like in the United States, the same kinds of measures, but there are some other things that are more unique to Israel. So Israel has developed an expertise in building desert adapted houses that require no air conditioning. They have thick adobe walls and they're insulated with mud bricks. The picture in the upper right is the passive air conditioning tower. This works by having water pumped into the tower. The water evaporates, cools the air, and then that air is used to cool the buildings. Another development is to use bases of old tires packed tight with biodegradable plastic containers, and they're cemented in a sense with local mud mixed with straw sealed with falafel oil. And that is used for buildings, small buildings, and playgrounds. There is straw bale building technology used for certain structures, small ones, and cannabis homes. The hemp is mixed with local limestone, and the natural insulation conserves 50% of the energy for heating and cooling. Recycling in Israel is underway. The municipal recycling rate, though, is only 20% and needs to increase. That compares to the US municipal recycling rate of about 35%. Israel's recycling policy is confusing. There's no unified recycling program. Local authorities implement different policies, causing confusion. And so the conclusion that I've been reading in a number of places is that there's poor public education about recycling. Many Israelis are ignorant about it, and many others are just bewildered. So this is something that Israel's working to improve. Composting. As you probably know, compost is a soil-like mixture. There is 2 million tons roughly of biodegradable waste yearly, mainly food waste and garden waste. About 12% is composted and recycled for use as fertilizer and nutrient-rich soil additive in other ways. But that 12% composting rate compares very favorably to the United States, in which we have a compost rate of less than 1%. 88% though of the bio-waste still goes into landfills, which all could be, or most of all could be, a renewable energy biogas source. Israel has always been short of water, right? Not enough rainfall, basically a desert kind of climate for the most part. So desalination for the water shortages has been critical. In 2005 was Israel's first desalination plant. And today about 80% of domestic water use is from large coastal desalination plants. They've become much more efficient, about 1/3 of the cost they were in the 1990s. Now, there are two technologies that are used for desalination: reverse osmosis and thermal technology. Reverse osmosis, salt water is pushed into membranes containing microscopic pores. The water gets through and the salt gets trapped. Thermal technology, you evaporate the water, the salt drops out, you condense the water by cooling it, and you get your water without the salt. Those are two of the pictures of large Israeli desalination plants. Most of the water in Israel is used for agriculture, 55%. And Israel excels at agricultural wastewater treatment on an unmatched scale anywhere in the world. In 2016, 85% of the domestic wastewater was recycled for agriculture. 50% of Israel's irrigation water comes from recycled wastewater. And you can see here that that part of the way this is done is using forests, for example, in which the water gets pumped or flows through the forest, the soil and the roots pull out various materials, and then the water can be used for irrigation. It's much cheaper than building all the new plants to do it. Now, that water cannot be used for drinking water, though, right? Necessarily, unless you also do some further filtering and cleansing of the water. On some kibbutz and other farms, people try to minimize the water usage by washing and recycling and showering, washing and showering after dusk with recycled water. There are many times when computer control helps to prevent overuse of water and other materials. So here we have online remote water monitoring treatment plants for farms, again, trying to minimize the amount of water that's necessary.
It's Jeff.
Even salt water is used when necessary.
What?
The software monitoring for agriculture includes monitoring water networks. Now that may sound like it might not mean much, but a lot of the purpose of that is to detect leaks and burst pipes. The end effect is that it saves millions of gallons of water a year. These advanced software programs for agriculture collect data using satellites, drones, and sensors. You see there one of the sensors. So what's called smart farming allows for lower inputs and increased output because you only input what you actually need. The algorithms are for real-time predictive analytics for energy requirements and usage. So you don't put in more fertilizer than you need. You don't put in more pest control than you need. You don't put in more water than you need. You have improved water usage, better crop health out of all that, and increased crop productivity while you minimize harm to the environment. Gray water treatment refers to using natural methods to cleanse the water. Now, the West Bank is off-grid, meaning off the Israeli wastewater grid for wastewater treatment. So gray water treatment, which we'll look at, produces about 40% of the non-drinking water for that area. And the area not only includes the Palestinians, it includes the Bedouins. This water is mainly for farming and irrigation and other uses like that. Low tech and low maintenance refers to the fact that local materials are used. You'll see that it doesn't require much electricity. It mainly uses natural forces of gravity for treatment. So if you look at the diagram there on the left, you have a pump and the input. It goes through a series of treatment ponds and then gets cleansed sufficiently for irrigation, for use in toilets. The processes are both aerobic and anaerobic to break down and feed on the chemical and organic components in the water. Aerobic there refers to where oxygen is being used, and anaerobic refers to where it's not an oxygen chemical process. In order to have drinking water, though, you need pre-treatment and post-treatment, such as settlement ponds or use of chlorine. These are modular units with gravel filtering and bacteria. Another area is sustainable food production. So the past palm grass shown with natural compost fertilizer instead of pesticides can be grown near the sea and needs less sunlight and oxygen, but is salt tolerant. There are organic biodiverse gardens. By growing multiple kinds of species together, it leads to a healthier soil, a healthier environment. There are desert tolerant aragon trees. Olive trees can be irrigated with brackish water, that is water with some salt in it. Ecological greenhouse fish breeding is used. So water is recycled for a disease-free environment. There's bacteria and biological filters for no discharge, very limited quantities of water. Some saltish water can be used. You get year-round production of fish, and these are often placed near centers of population where the food's going to be used, which not only saves on transportation costs, but it cuts down on the CO2 from transportation. Microalgae production produces food that has protein, nutrients, and antioxidants. There's organic fruit for jams, juices, and dried fruit. A lot of this is done with plant monitoring computer systems. Automated bee care. Artificial pollination devices are used to disperse harvested pollen. And an example of a new startup with sustainable food production is one that uses wine residue and turns it into a nutritional supplement. Food types are changed. There are crops grown from salt water taken from aquifers. Drought-resistant plants are bred from, and then there are new varieties of vegetables and fruit that maximize the yield per volume of water used. And this includes asparagus, wheat, melons, tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, dates, zucchini, and avocado. Ancient strains of wheat, such as emmer, are grown. Emmer was eaten in biblical times, so they're taking some ancient food and making it more used today. Pest resistance and biological control methods try to avoid chemicals and use fewer resources. So for example, biological control of fruit flies, sterile male fruit flies are put in to the area. In addition, biopesticides can be used where plant extracts and oils are used to create a pesticide without using harmful chemicals. This has led to improved Israeli tomatoes and a variety of field crops. Another innovation is cocoon PVC crop bags. Climate change has increased the insect problem in the world in two ways. First of all, rising temperatures cause some insects to digest more food, which means they're eating more crops. Also, insects are cold-blooded, so they become more active and reproduce more. Already, 1/3 of the world's food is lost to insects instead of being used for human consumption. So these particular PVC crop bags prevent insect destruction of harvested crops. Burlap bags won't do that. In addition, pesticides for crop storage are not needed. So here we're protecting grain, rice, spices, legumes, and other crops. And the absence of pesticides not only is good for human consumption, the human consumer, but also safer for the farmers themselves. These bags range in size, for example, from 5 to 300 tons per bag for grain, and smaller bags can be used for other crops. Now let's turn to the sea, the beautiful sea there. Rising sea levels are attributed to climate change, which are going to cut the coastal beach, cause erosion, and deteriorate coastal stability. There's an estimated sea level rise of 1/2 meter and a loss of coastline 10 to 50 meters deep by 2050. Now, the studies are still going on because historically the monitoring has not been good, so there's not good data, and the predictions are still at early stages. Israel itself is continuing to study this climate change problem, hasn't figured out what to do. Many countries haven't figured out what to do, including, for the most part, our country, the United States. As you probably know, birds have suffered greatly because of climate change and changes to ecosystems. 500 million birds a year migrated through Israel in the past on international flight paths that always crossed Israel. But desertification and drought have eliminated many of their African winter areas. So now we've got more birds wintering in Israel. That caused a problem, crop destruction, because the birds have to eat. So ornithology reserves were created where the birds can live and eat natural food for them in those reserves and not take so many of the farmers' crops. There was an earlier Israeli innovation that also is helping with this issue, and that is changes in airplane flight paths during bird migration. The Israelis were actually losing a fair number of aircraft to bird collisions or damage to those aircraft. Even the Israeli Air Force had to change its flight patterns during the migration. So they spent a fair amount of effort using radar and ground observation in order to really map these flight paths and create changes in the airline and airplane flights during the migration periods. These innovations by Israel have had international benefits. Israel conducts education and training programs, creative ecological and environmental programs, including the kibbutzes, demonstration projects, technical expertise teams, and the subjects include organic food production, that is without pesticides or insecticides, solar power, fighting forest fires, preventing them, clean water. And one of the beneficiaries of Israeli technology has been Africa. You know, Africa has suffered increasing conditions because of climate change, about drought, poverty, hunger, thirst, and disease. Israel has created more than 150 solar and agriculture projects in 8 countries, helping more than 1 million people. Solar, water power, and agricultural technologies have been brought to rural African villages. These include water pumps for clean water, both for drinking and with drip irrigation brought in as well. Refrigerators. Now, refrigerators are not only important for food, but for medicine. We've all heard about the COVID vaccine and the extreme refrigeration techniques needed there, but many medicines and vaccines need refrigeration. So refrigerators are important from a medical and health standpoint, as well as from a food standpoint. Lighting. Lighting from solar power is important, not just so you can walk around um, and get around some, but for students to be able to study, for example, which they couldn't do before very well without electric lights. The Israelis have also brought in aquaculture fisheries. I mentioned the drip irrigation for crops. They've brought natural fermentation proteins, greenhouse gas management, fish farming, and dairy farming. Now, this is all great, but at times it can be dangerous because of conditions in parts of Africa. So for example, in November of this past year, 2020, 9 Israelis had to be rescued because Ethiopia had a sudden civil war. There were 5 irrigation workers and 4 humanitarian volunteers that had to be rescued by a combination of United Nations forces and the Ethiopian army suddenly at Israel's request. An example of a project is, we'll take Kenya, the collaborative project in Turkana, Kenya. The people there were facing severe water issues, soil not suitable for cultivation, high temperatures due to climate change, and even in the past they've had high temperatures, droughts, pests. So with the Israelis, training farms were created where local residents worked with Israeli specialists. They selected the crops that were more suitable for local conditions, added fertilization and pest control. Lime inlets were dug to pool rainwater. Now, lime inlets have been used in Israel and the Negev, as some of you may know, for planting trees and other purposes for a long time. All they are artificial earthen construction dams, which collect the floodwaters from the runoff, but the water gets slowed by the dam so that it can actually be collected and used. And then a controlled area is flooded so the water drains into the soil where you want the water. 132 farms were established producing vegetables and fruit, including chickpeas, beans, and melons. China and India have also been the beneficiaries of the Israeli technology. In terms of desalinization plants, they've certainly increased the water supplies of both China and India. I was in Tianjin a few years ago for another climate change purpose, but they took me to the desalinization plant there, which they're very proud of, and it's very large. It uses the thermal technology, and you see a picture of it there. In India, floodwater runoff collection systems were constructed using lime inlets. There were training seminars conducted in Israel and in the home countries to include greenhouse gas management, drip irrigation, fish farming, and dairy farming. I saw drip irrigation in places in China that really surprised me, both in the east of China and also in the far west in Xinjiang province in Western China. They were using drip irrigation as well. Going back to forest fires now, as wildlife fires burn more fiercely across the globe, and of course we saw them in our country, as well as in Canada and other places, the Israeli experts have been working to implement prevention, detection, firefighting techniques, and rehabilitation strategies. Experts from Israel have been provided to California, Brazil, and Australia, and they've been training the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, France, Italy, and Spain. Additional international benefits have occurred through training seminars in Israel, South America, Central America, India, and China. Drip irrigation, fish farming, dairy farming. The Pacific Island nation, they engineered low-tech gravity water systems to use mountain springs. In Nepal, drip irrigation pools, zero wastewater systems, and less water-intense farming, as well as beekeeping. In Ecuador, Water purification systems was built without electricity, using sterilized medical devices for the water treatment filters such as medical dialyzer. In addition, here we have the Lyman inlets again for floodwater runoff collection systems. And you see a picture of one there in the lower right. That's what it looks like at the collection point. This was taught to farmers in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Mexico. Now, Israel, as you probably know, is a hotbed of innovation of various kinds. And the innovations that hopefully may be the future for us, although they're still in the innovation stage, include all electric airplane, clean water from atmospheric water generators, water recycling, which are like big dehumidifiers to make 7 gallons of water a day, portable lightweight rain harvesting devices for clean drinking water, bacterial water treatment. And the picture you see there, and we're on the ceiling in this picture, so you're looking down, right? Those lights are vertical, they're not horizontal. So these indoor farms are to produce crops with less water and without using land. There's an innovation to convert wood chips into sugar feedstock and trash solutions to reduce landfill methane emissions. There's an Israeli startup that's invented a new compost bin. The compost bin turns kitchen waste into gas so that each liter of waste creates 200 liters of stovetop gas. Other innovations are biotoilets, thermal oxidation of human and animal waste to make it into fertilizer, edible shot glasses, so you don't need to actually drink the drink, you just put the whole thing in your mouth, and biodegradable plastics. Now, I want to stop on that one for a minute because it's an example of a question in terms of climate change policy, of whether something actually achieves what it should achieve or leaves something to be desired. So the composting time frame to break something down is about 6 months. It may differ with whether you're close to land or sea or certain things, but about 6 months, okay? These biodegradable plastic bags take 3 years to break down. While they're breaking down, living things underground may consume them, or above ground, depending on how they're left. So the question there as a policy matter is that type of biodegradable plastic really something we want, or is it still insufficient in terms of the benefits? Another startup is extracting cellulose from wood pulp and paper production. Now, climate change also has regional implications. At Beth Emet, our synagogue, Rachel Haverlock taught a class on the book of Joshua in modern Israel, and she noted that there's a need for regional climate change solutions involving Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians at least, because, for example, of the Dead Sea and Jordan River watershed issues. Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority are linked by common aquifers. There's also, all of them have higher ambient temperatures, less precipitation, overdrafting, that is overuse of water supplies, and issues of contamination of water. The Israel Ministry of Environment reports to the UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework Conference on Climate Change, that Israel does have possible regional initiatives to deal with climate change. But so far, those have not been going anywhere other than in the report to the UNFCCC. What actually goes in the other direction, in a sense, is technology such as off-grid gray water treatment plants for Palestinian areas, because what that does is isolate those areas from connection to Israel, which, depending on one's politics and how one foresees the future, can be viewed in a couple ways. But it does avoid creating a cooperative grid situation, which would be much better from a climate change perspective for the entire area. So a question remains whether climate change and technology will create sufficient incentives for peaceful cooperation and coexistence. Now I am going to find my screen share. And I'm trying to stop screen share, there we go. Okay, so that's my part of the program. And now I want to turn it over to my friend and co-congregant, Harry Rhodes, who's going to give you some additional perspectives on tree planting and peace initiatives from a personal standpoint of experiences, as well as from that standpoint on food and an Israeli kibbutz. So Harry?
Thanks, Mark. That was fascinating, and now everyone heard a lot of ideas and theory. I'm going to share more personal experience of living in Israel and working in environmental and social action causes. I grew up in northern suburb in Wilmette, Illinois, and was part of Beth Emet in Evanston since I was a small child, and learned from Beth Emet a lot of my ideals and goals related to social action and the environment came from growing up at Beth Emet. After high school, 1978, I moved to Israel and spent most of the next 22, 23 years in Israel. A lot of that time I spent in the Arava, in the southern desert of Israel, something that Mark was talking about, desertification. I spent time on kibbutzim. Many of you probably have heard of them, Kibbutz Keturah, as well as the Reform kibbutzim of Yahel and Lotan. Keturah and Lotan have really strong environmental programs. That Lotan with a green apprenticeship program that also have to do, they bring in Palestinians and people from all over the world to the work that they're doing. Mark was talking about desertification and how that impacts the area in Israel. The Arava, as much as it's a beautiful desert, is also an example of greening the desert and changing the desert. Anyone who comes from the north of Israel, driving down to the Arava, as you go down into the Arava, you see green all over in front of you, moshavim, kibbutzim. Some of the most innovative agriculture is happening there. And I worked in some of those projects. I worked in melon fields, onion fields, not real pleasant. And I worked in a date field for a year working the drip irrigation. Mark was talking about the little drippers. It's advanced a lot since when I was there. We used to have to go around and fix the drips that got stuck that Mark was talking about. From the desert, I moved to the north. I moved to Shorashim up in the Galilee, and found there that something that I then worked in for many years was Jewish-Arab coexistence. I found that the Jewish communities were totally separated from the Arab communities, including work related to environmental efforts to improve the environment. We got to know our neighbors. Shorashim got to know our neighbors in the nearest village of Sha'ab on Tu B'Shvat. On Tu B'Shvat, we always celebrate Tu B'Shvat and plant trees. Planting trees is something that's ingrained in all Israelis. to plant trees, especially on Tu B'Shvat, but all the time. And so on one of the first Tu B'Shvat, I think was 1987, when we were out celebrating, we noticed a group of people coming from the Arab village near us, and we didn't really know them at the time. They were coming, they had things in their hands. We were a little bit nervous. And so we sent out our person in charge of security. Every community has someone in charge of security in Israel. And to greet them and say, hey, what are you coming for? And the principal of the school was leading the group. A good friend of mine, Yasser, he said, we're coming to plant trees with you and to welcome you to our community, larger community. And since that time, every year on Tu B'Shvat, we started an organization called Shemesh. We would celebrate Tu B'Shvat and plant trees together and work on other environmental issues. And the concept, I don't think a lot of people were talking about it at the time, but the concept of environmental justice was not something people were real aware of. The idea that everyone should be working with recycling and other issues to keep the environment clean and healthy. In Israel, as in many places, the marginalized communities, the Arab communities, poorer communities, tended to be not as clean and not as environmentally conscientious. And you see that all over the world. We certainly see that here. And it's part of just them being marginalized and not being included. The environmental movement tended to be a very, what's the best word? Here we would say it's a very white movement for most of the people in the leading organizations tend to be white and leave out brown and black communities around the country. And of course, when it comes to climate change and environmental issues, those are the communities that suffer the most. So in Israel, it's the same. The Arab communities tend to suffer the most from environmental issues and environmental problems, and they're not included usually in the solutions. So we, as part of Jewish-Arab coexistence and working together, we believed in changing that and had many projects, first in the Galilee, and then when I worked in Akko, to work together on improving the environment. And it was a great way to bring people together and to do it differently than what's usually done. In 2001, I moved back here to the States, again, got involved in Beth Emet, great community. And I started working in Chicago in urban agriculture, an organization called Growing Home, which works for changing lives and changing communities through urban agriculture. Today, it's one of the biggest, most active urban farms in the city and around the country, based in Englewood on the south side. And again, working for environmental justice, it was something that was at the heart of everything that we were doing at Growing Home. I connected again, it's very interesting, I connected again with Kibbutz Lotan while I was working at Growing Home. Alex, who was one of the leaders of the Green Apprenticeship programs at Lotan, did a visit here to Chicago and came to see our farms. And we've been in touch ever since, talking about ideas and ways that we can work together, even from afar, to improve the environment and to work on issues such as climate change. I recently, about a year and a half ago, I left Growing Home. Been there 17 years and seen it grow, and it's still an active, terrific organization. And started working with an organization called FACT, Food Animal Concerns Trust, which has been in Chicago since 1982 with a little bit of a different bent, working with a vision that all food producing animals will be produced in a healthy and humane manner so that everybody will have access to safe and humanely produced food. And we work a lot with humane farmers. We work with regenerative, someone asked about regenerative agriculture. That's something we're working with and very actively with, and regenerative grazing. I think I often hear when people talk about climate change, well, agriculture is bad for the climate, and animal agriculture especially is really bad for the climate. Industrial agriculture is bad, and the way the majority of animals are raised is terrible. Terrible for the animals, terrible for the people raising them. I heard today about some accident at a poultry processing plant, awful place in Georgia where 6 people were killed. We're trying to change that. And when animals are raised humanely as part of a holistic agriculture regenerative process, then it's good for the environment and it does not harm the climate as well. So I think the ideas of environmental justice, social justice, inclusion, those are things that are really at the heart of what I've been working for and believe in. And I think that anyone working for climate change has to make sure that poor people and marginalized communities are included in all of our efforts. Because it's everybody, and especially people in those communities, who are likely to suffer. So
Harry, before you go further,
yeah.
The term regenerative for agriculture and humane animal production may not be familiar to all of those who are with us today. So can you explain that a bit?
Industrial agriculture often extracts minerals, extracts all the good things from the soil. Regenerative agriculture puts it back. So instead of just growing corn, you'd have a system where you grow vegetables, and you grow it organically using cover crops and things that put carbon back into the earth. So it's a regenerative system. And animals fit in by raising them on the pasture, creating pasture that's healthy for the animals, because cows don't usually eat grain. They're not supposed to be eating corn, which is what's usually fed to cows. They eat grass. So if you have a farm with pasture with different crops and different grasses, it's healthier for the animals as well as being healthier for the planet.
So that relates to the organic biodiverse gardens that I referred to in Israel as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay,
and there are
great.
some in Israel. There was a question about regenerative agriculture in Israel. There's some, not enough.
Okay. Thanks, Harry. All right, so let me go to the chat, Marcy. Let me come back here with Harry to the middle, or however we can do it. Let me go up on the chat and we'll just see what we have here so far. Okay, let's see here. Let's see. Does the government have a serious plan to get off of fossil fuels? Is climate a motivating issue at all in the Israeli electorate? From what I have seen, Marcy, can you put me back next to Harry? Because I don't know how to do that.
So that you
that
both
possible?
keep spotlighted.
Yeah.
Hang on.
Marcy Dickman is our technical guru here, who will save the day, I hope, since I don't know how to do certain things. Well, that's okay. Leave Harry in the middle because he's better looking. And So renewables and off of fossil fuels, is that a motivating issue? Israel is serious about getting off of fossil fuels and having more renewables, mainly solar, because it's better for their economy as well as better for them politically in terms of climate change. How much of a motivating issue is this in the Israeli electorate?
I just wanted to add, as I said,
Yeah.
Haaretz recently had an article that Israel has a plan to be carbon neutral by 2035. They
Yes.
hadn't done a lot as far as a plan till now, but now there is one that the government has created.
Right, although it's always a question of which government has created it and how long that government will be in power lately. I have not seen any polls in Israel, and we did a program, by the way, on Israeli culture today from a book that was recommended by the Jewish Agency's educational program, and climate was not a particular issue that resonated, it appeared, highly with the Israeli electorate, from what I can tell, but I have not seen a poll or anything that would give me a definitive answer. I don't know if you've seen anything, Harry.
It's been up and down. There was, when Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister, the department was much more active. So
Mhm.
again, it depends which government is leading and who's leading right now. I think they seem to be concerned with other things, and when you have elections every 2 or 3 times a year, it makes it difficult to come up with clear plans, I think.
Yeah, Harry, I know you put the answer in the chat, but do you want to repeat it? So, because now everybody was looking at the chat about the Hula Valley wetlands.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. It's certainly, someone mentioned it's one of the biggest bird migratory areas in the world, which it is, and it's a beautiful place for anybody who can go visit. But Israel, in the early days when it was trying to dry up the swamps, went and did a lot of work in the Hula Valley and dried up some areas, flooded other areas, and kind of created a mess in what they did. The idea was to create agriculture there, but it did not really succeed. And then they started a restoration project, which someone who was in the chat room, I think, may know more than I do about it. I know they've started it, but I don't know where it stands now. But I do know I visited there, and if you go there, it's a beautiful place to visit, and you can often, if you go at the right time, you can see the birds coming through.
And Harry, another answer you gave in the chat, but just if you could repeat it for everybody, because not everybody's looking at the chat. There was a question from Elliot: how prevalent is the use of methods of regenerative agriculture to preserve soil health?
Yeah, and there was also, is Israel self-sufficient with food production? So I think the regenerative agriculture is not the most prevalent form of agriculture in Israel right now, and organic has not spread in Israel like it has here. On the other hand, every city, everywhere you go, they have an outdoor market, and you can get the freshest, best vegetables and fruits, certainly a lot fresher than what you can find here. It's like going to a farmer's market here, but in Israel, it's just more common. It's also because of the weather. It's year round that you can go there. The farmers, on the other hand, if they're growing dates or oranges or even tomatoes, if they can, the best product they have, they export to Europe because that's where they can make the most money.
There was a question about whether my slides will be available. Technically not. The recording is supposed to be given to the festival, but not the slides. But if anybody wants to email me, it goes to that trouble, and you see my name on the screen. It's the email is mark.schoenfield@gmail.com. I will PDF my slides and send them to you, and I'm flattered that you would inquire. There was a question about whether, do you know Chauvel, which I assume is for you, Harry, because I don't know who that is.
Yeah, I don't know Chauvel.
Okay. And let's
Mark, that
see.
was from me, Paul Peterson.
Okay.
Cheval is in the Negev. Harry, you were
Oh.
talking about the Negev, and my
Yeah.
wife was born there, so I was just curious.
Oh.
They do drip irrigation, and they had cows and
Okay,
all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thought it was a person, but I've heard of
No, kibbutz Cheval.
community.
All right. Elliot also posted in the chat, if anybody takes a look, that, and we appreciate this, Elliot. This is one of the fun things about doing programs is you often get knowledgeable people to be part of the program. You learn things. A website for a drawdown organization, which has information on methods for combating climate change. So if you're interested, take a look at the chat and take a look at what Elliot posted there. Let me mention, because I noticed a couple of people entering, that I know that the festival made a big mistake about the time of this originally. They assured me yesterday, after I had an email and a phone call with the head of the festival, that they had corrected this. I am sorry if anybody came late. We are recording the session. So if you did not get the correct information and came late, you will be able to see a recording of it. And I apologize to you, even though it was not my fault. I had no control over any of this. And I won't tell you what I said to myself when I saw the mistake. Okay. Marcy was good enough to put my email in the chat. Okay, so that's what I think we have on the chat.
Yeah, there's one other question there.
Go ahead.
Where can you find good information? And for me, the best information I find is from Haaretz, from the newspaper. They cover everything, including environmental issues, climate change. So if you can research there, or you can just get a subscription and read Haaretz every day. That's one thing I like to do.
Well, I'll mention as well that I did not actually know all the things in my presentation before I decided to research it a couple months ago. And so all I did is I went on Google and I put in Israel climate change. And I found all the material there that I think I would ever need to teach an entire course on it, although I certainly didn't use all that material today. So that's another way you can keep up with it. If you just want to know about Israel, if you do Google and you just Google Israeli news, you get the Times, you get the Post, you get Haaretz, you get Al Jazeera at times and some other things, and you can decide what stories you want to read. Marcy, let's go to, if you would, just regular screen. So as many people showing as we can, because if people have additional questions, maybe they can raise their hand and we can call on them if we can see people. Although the festival sort of discouraged this, I don't know if you can unmute yourself to ask your question or not. Marcy's nodding yes, people
You should be able to
could.
unmute yourselves. Yeah.
Okay, so how about if we try to politely with each other, if you have something else, a question or a comment, if you want to unmute yourself, you're going to find yourself on the center screen, I have a feeling, for a minute, asking your question or making your comment, but this group seems to be, from what I can tell, sensible. So let's try a civilized way of doing this. So if anybody wants to jump in themselves and make a question or have a comment, go right ahead. We have a little time left. We're going to end by 9 or before 9 because the festival wants us to make that a hard stop. So anything else anybody wants to say? You're looking at Marcy, who's our technical
Jesse.
guru and this
Jesse.
wonderful person. And Jesse's got her hand up. Oh, good. Okay, Jesse.
Well, this may be really a naive question, but how widespread are the techniques that you were describing that are used in Israel for all sorts of things, the deforestation and the water? How widespread is that in US technology?
Well, I think it depends on what technology you're talking about. You know, I know that drip irrigation is used in some places in the United States and other places in the world, for example, but much of our climate doesn't require that. So I think we'd have to go through it technology by technology, Jesse, in order
What
to
about
answer
the
your question.
What about the fire, the top of the trees fire?
You know, that is not out yet. That's still, they're still about to build the prototype. They're actually still taking money if you want to make a big investment with your retirement fund. Um, I'm not quite that sold on it, but they seem to be a good company. I mean, I talked to the people, they seem to be good people. So that they're about to build the prototype. And I think once they do, there's a lot of interest in the United States and elsewhere in that. But Israeli experts did come to California to try to help the California firefighters deal with all the fires there and prevent further fires from happening, because California has been, you know, one of the worst places for fires in the United States. Okay, what else do we have? Thanks, Jesse.
I'll just jump in with another thought about Israel and the environment in general is Israel is a place of many contradictions, as you may know, and one of them has to do with the environment. So all Israelis, they love to go on Tiyulim, they love to go on hikes, they love to be in with nature. There's songs about nature. There's just people live much closer to nature, and it's a smaller country, so it's easier to get to places that are more natural. On the other hand, it's very modern. Concrete has taken over, roads have taken over, and people who go out on their hikes and go out to party in the many parks often leave a lot of garbage behind. So, you know, there's an awareness of nature and a love of nature and then the environment, but preserving it doesn't always happen.
Now, politically, though, Israel has used the work it has done on climate change politically in order to show that it should be treated better internationally than it gets treated by a lot of countries. So I know Ted raised his hand, and then we're going to look at Jamie P's question in the chat. So Ted?
I was just thinking as you were presenting it, how Israel sort of seems like it could be this really vibrant laboratory experiment sort of compared to the United States. But I guess I just look at the difference in what you just referred to, the size and the diversity, and it just seems hard to connect, for me to connect what's happening in Israel with what's happening here. I guess some of the issues are the same, but the size of the country is so much different, and the diversity.
Yeah, Ted, I will say that when I was an NGO delegate for the United States Business Council for Sustainable Development at the UN Framework Climate Change Conferences, you know, what was important there were two things. One, to try to get the big countries to take big steps, but secondly, to get innovations and concrete examples of steps forward on climate change from any country that was doing it, so that countries could learn from each other. So there really is, you know, even though Israel is small and we're big, and differences in certain aspects, there are things that the United States can use, but as importantly, as we saw there, Africa and other places can use these techniques, just like, you know, China, India, and the big countries can. So your question's a good one about how are these things impactful. Now in the chat, let's see, Jamie P, can cement be removed at large scale so there'd be more land again in Los Angeles for tree planting, to allow more prescriptive burns on city and country lands for forest fire in the future. Well, certainly, there's talk in California about, and in the United States, in many places, because so much of the open land and the forests are actually owned by the federal government, about better prescriptive burns or allowing certain things to happen and grow to prevent forest fires. But in terms of tearing up concrete at large scale, physically, I know it can be done. Politically, I have no idea. Harry, I don't know if you have a comment on this one.
I don't know. No.
Okay. And what else do we have? Anything else tonight?
If you're trying to get our attention also, you can just unmute yourself and speak.
Okay. Well, then I think, not hearing no other voices, I want to thank you all for showing up tonight and participating with us. Thank you, Elliot and Paul and other people are making comments. This was nice for all of us, I hope, and I hope we all learn together. And so have a good evening and take care, everybody. And let's all work together on this very important moral and political issue of climate change. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Harry.
Thank you all.
Good night, thanks.
Night.
Thank you. This was excellent.
Bye, Marcy.
Where will this recording be available for people that weren't here to hear?
Mark, I think Mark.